Chapter 6 19 years earlier. Year 855 PXF. Autumn. The storm had been raging outside for 3 days. Freezing rain and sleet had made the trails treacherous and darkened the skies day and night, making travel impossible. However, the cold and darkness that plagued Tavi's ruined body were not just from the weather. The corrupted shard wedged between his ribs that contained the boy's cursed soul was feeding his despair, pushing his mind into dark corners better left unvisited. Alone and shivering in the night, Tavi had little strength or hope left to call upon the elements to aid him. Months before, Tavi, in his hubris, had not returned to the Isles with the afflicted boy to fulfill his Omanara. He was confident he could banish the infernal infection at a nearby minor upwelling of elemental power. Wrongly surmising what had taken root in the boy's body would weaken if removed from the dark forces permeating the Courvermain estate, and perhaps even be destroyed just from exposure to the site he had chosen, Tavi traveled north into the Dwarven Mountains. Taking the boy deep into the crystal caves there, Tavi naively thought his only task would be to watch over this boy Riken and cast minor healing magics as the elements did their work. But he had woefully underestimated the forces working against him. The parasitic conjuring had not weakened. If anything, it had been fortified by the elemental forces rising from deep under the mountains. Tavi did not recognize the extent of the cursed disease's power until it thwarted his considerable elemental gifts and most potent rituals. When Tavi finally thought he had the upper hand and was on the verge of banishing the corruption, he realized too late that the conjured parasite had one final avenue of escape. It ripped the boy's weakened body apart to avoid being dispelled, the malignant curse just as content to feed on Riken's soul as it had been feeding on his life. That was when despair first planted its seeds in Tavi's mind. The Fate Singer had told him the importance of this boy, how critical he was to everything to come, so he took the only option left to him. He captured the boy's soul in one of the cave's crystals and, to keep the soul intact, fed his own life force into the shard to sustain the boy's spirit contained within. The failed ritual to save Riken's life had taken every bit of strength Tavi had, and the added burden of the shard and its precious cargo ravaged his physical form as he traveled home. He was very nearly dead when he reached Horizon's End, with only enough will remaining to draw on the restorative energies he had stockpiled and bound there. He had not stayed long at his home, just over a fortnight. Riken's soul was too fragile, and it would be too easy to ignore Destiny's call if he remained. The warring temptation to release the human boy's soul to the fates and never leave again, versus the need to fulfill his Omanara and his destiny was too close at hand at Horizon's End. It threatened to tear Tavi apart as thoroughly as the spell had ripped apart Riken. As soon as he had gathered enough energy and hardened himself for the journey he knew he must now take, Tavi left under the dark of night, hoping he might return one day. The trip across Kaiflanor was arduous, his magic barely sustaining his failing body and dwindling spirit. Tavi's only companion was a silent willico of a fisherman that appeared to him every day or so, always ahead on the trail, disappearing over the next rise behind a stand of trees or rockfall. 6 weeks of travel had brought him this far, but there was part of him that believed with each passing day he might not make it any further. With winter approaching and no insight from the elements if the storm would last another hour or another week, Tavi was losing hope. He could feel the Argestian inception in the distance, but it was still leagues away. Tavi knew if he did not stave off the despair growing in his soul, he would not survive. It was just a matter of what would kill him first. Tavi didn't remember packing his paints. Perhaps they had already been in the pack as he filled it full of supplies when he absconded off on this current journey in the middle of the night. It didn't matter how. All that mattered was they were here and perhaps the only thing that could save him. With the wind whipping outside the cave and fire banked to give even light, Tavi lifted his brush to paint the image he had kept locked in his mind along every step of this never-ending Omanara. The vision the Fate Singer had gifted him on the cliffs outside Horizon's End, and that now was his everything. Present day, year 874 PXF. Autumn. With complete trust and faith, Osman allowed Wilfred to guide them forward. Grimspire loomed large to their west, dominating nearly a quarter of the horizon as they climbed the slopes of the Shieldwall Spine, hopefully toward a pass that would get them to the southern coast of Kaiflanor and the Argestian Inception. The marching progression of the seasons now had daylight and darkness splitting the day evenly, with the winds of autumn carrying the bite of the coming winter. Osman had resigned himself that whether the Inception was found or not, he would be spending the winter on the tundra of southern Kaiflanor. Since the breaking of Wilfred's cyclical existence, Osman began to fill the hours of their trekking with talk and musings in place of Wilfred's fishtails. He told stories of his Hearth's Rest duels through the trellis markets of Arnador, tavern crawls with Talon, and barracks follies with his fellow guards. Wilfred listened attentively as far as Osman could surmise, and even threw in some relevant sailors' musings and commentary when appropriate. Still, even the most lively stories could not banish away the trudging enormity of the obstacles in their path. As they, inch by inch, made their way up the steep slopes of the Shieldwall Spine to the invisible path that Wilfred could only indicate with a pointed finger and repeated phrase, "Follow the current," Osman put words to the insecurities gnawing at his mind. Calling to the stout figure ahead of him who, even with his incorporeal nature, inexplicably seemed to be putting in as much effort in the climb as he was, Osman confessed, "Wilfred, I'm not sure if I know why I'm even doing this anymore." Wilfred stopped his ascent and waited for Osman to elaborate, giving him his full attention. "Leaving the Hall of Judgment, it was a debt to Lady Corvermain. Then, arriving here on the Isles, I confronted how completely I had betrayed my Crodron in his hour of most need, and my Catmalorn debt to him eclipsed all else." Osman paused and sighed, then continued with a melancholy lament. "But with everything I have learned about my father, Riken, and even the Fate Singer's hand, I just feel used. Like a baited bear that doesn't know when to fall down and instead keeps getting cut to ribbons by his tormentors." Wilfred seemed to be searching for something to say, some comfort or wisdom, but Osman filled the silence himself. "It's okay. I know you don't have the words, and they aren't necessary. There is only one path to choose now. I only hope my misgivings aren't the stone that eventually blocks our way forward." Wilfred laid a ghostly hand on Osman's shoulder and repeated, "Follow the current," pointing up the slope. Osman's eyes followed his guide's outstretched finger and finally saw what Wilfred was referring to. Two swirling eddies broke the line of clouds above, not unlike how sea foam swirls through a broken sandbar. Osman excitedly repeated back, "Follow the current! Of course! The wind through the pass breaks the clouds, showing its location." Osman surged past Wilfred with a smile and charged up the dwindling trail, shouting, "Well, come on, you old salty sack! Don't just sit there like a beached tide hopper! Let's go!" The words he had shared with Wilfred about his misgivings and reasons for being here rattled around Osman's mind for the rest of the day and through the next. They had found the pass below the break in the clouds just as Wilfred had predicted, and crested the ridge of the Shieldwall Spine before making camp. Suddenly, the next step of their journey seemed very close. Looking up at the angled peak of Grimspire, Osman's mind told him there must be leagues still to travel before Alarice's painting would match the looming landmark overhead. Nevertheless, his whole body felt like it was experiencing the last moments before being carried by a rushing current over a waterfall. "I think I hate Riken," Osman blurted out as he stirred a pot of hot broth as it simmered on their small campfire banked against the howling wind. No keel accompanied his assertion, but Osman couldn't be sure if its absence was because of Riken's connection to his father, or if the feeling wasn't a true one. They had made camp in a protected alcove made by boulders that had fallen as part of a large rock slide into the mountain pass. The swirling wind through the flickering campfire made every shadow cast on the sheltering rocks writhe in a frenetic dance. Wilfred furrowed his brow with concern and disappointment. Osmond reconsidered his admission and tried to put into words what he was feeling.
Maybe not hate him, but everything that has happened because of him.
The volume of Osmond's voice drifted louder as he continued.
I want to hit him or shake him and ask him if he knows all he has taken from me.
Osmond's diatribe picked up pace as he continued.
He stole my father from me, my childhood, my home, my Crodron, my life.
His words echoed through the pass as the wind stilled between gusts. The silence surrounding the camp stretched out to what seemed like days. Even the wind seemed to be stilled by Osmond's outburst. Finally, Wilfred spoke.
Have you heard of the fisherman's folly?
Osmond couldn't tell if Wilfred's voice were a spark of sentience or a so often repeated story that it seemed conversational. Wilfred continued as his form shimmered in the firelight.
Many a young angler will chase angrily after a single fish that got away, as they let the catch in their boat spoil.
The old fisherman's eyes landed pointedly on Osmond.
They never appreciate the bounty of all the fish they've landed along the way, because they can't see past the spite for that one fish they feel is eluding them.
Wilfred looked pointedly at Osmond and said sagely,
Look to the bounty in your own boat, and not to the sea for what might have been.
Hearing the words but not wanting to accept them, Osmond mindlessly tried to explain why his situation was different.
But look at what he's done to me. I grew up without parents because of the Omanara my father took for him. When he did make appearances at Horizon's End, my father had been ravaged by the actions he had to take for Riken.
Seeing no change in Wilfred's expression, Osmond pressed on in a pleading voice.
What he did made me maim my soul and sever the emotions I had for my father and my home.
Wilfred's eyebrow now rose, and in the telltale halting cadence that signified these were his words and not repeated phrases, he asked leadingly,
So, Riken made you do that now, did he?
Wilfred continued logically,
Riken, the dead human lad who knows nothing of Oldani customs or rituals, forced you to commit the atrocity you inflicted on yourself.
Osmond dropped his eyes, but then raised them again, unwilling to acknowledge his culpability for his actions.
And when I'd finally found a family, a Crodron, he was ripped away from me, again because of damned Riken.
Wilfred kept his steady stare leveled at Osmond. His questioning eyebrow lowered, and his expression fell into one of sadness and disappointment. He said no further words, gave no comfort or additional wisdom. The wind returned, gusting around the boulders and through the pass. The Solenfell, which had seemed frozen in the sky above them, began to flow along its winding path once again. Wilfred's fishing pole appeared in the Willico's hands, and he cast his line into the fire, float bobbing among the flames. Osmond pulled his simmering broth off the fire and stood up abruptly, frustrated that Wilfred refused to see his side of the story. He assured himself that Riken was the cause of all of this. Growing up unloved and unwanted, the numbness now infecting his emotions, him abandoning his homeland, losing the one bit of happiness and family he had with Talon, and now even being here on the edge of the world, most likely to die frozen and alone. The logical parts of Osmond's mind tried to break through his self-pity, using Wilfred's words as a chisel, but they could find no purchase in the wall of moral certitude Osmond had erected around his current emotional state. He chugged his broth, the hot liquid burning his tongue and throat, adding to his foul mood. Despite the howling wind and cold, Osmond abandoned the camp and walked into the night, letting his legs decide which direction to take. He did not venture further through the pass or back the way they came, but instead retreated further into the narrow canyon and stacked boulders sheltering their camp. Osman walked for longer than he thought possible down the winding canyon, squeezing around boulders and climbing over tree falls. When he had finally walked off his frustration and decided to return to camp and face Wilfred, he determinedly snapped his body around in his tracks, surprising the beast that had silently stalked him. Deftly perched on one of the small ledges that ran just above head height along the length of the canyon, white fur and saber fangs glowing in the moonlight, was a crouching saldrig. The predatory cat looked down on Osman with its ice-blue eyes cold as the glaciers they mimicked. The saldrig was easily 3 times Osman's weight, with claws and teeth far more effective than the iron dagger in his belt. Even if he had his twin swords and armor from the Arnador Watch, Osman was unsure if he could survive a fight against the great cat. Osman could only hope the deadly predator above him was only curious and not hungry, but with winter approaching, he thought it unlikely. Slowly taking steps backward, one behind the other, Osman inched deeper into the canyon. The saldrig, having been discovered, no longer stalked from above, but leaped to the canyon floor and paced forward as Osman retreated. The canyon grew even more narrow, and Osman could now easily place his outstretched hands on opposite walls as they closed in on him. His fear that the saldrig was pushing him toward its den or an ambush by its cubs or mate was soon realized as his back hit solid rock and the canyon's end. There was no escape. The saldrig continued to advance, and Osman instinctively drew Talon's iron dagger from his belt. The beast's deep growl seemed to vibrate the very foundations of the canyon as it saw the weapon in Osman's hand. He wondered if he even wanted to defend himself. His shoulders dropped as he contemplated if having his story end here might not be easier. The saldrig scented the air around Osman, took a deep breath, and roared through its saber fangs into his face. Its hot breath billowed across Osman's cold skin. An almost human look of disdain crossed the mighty cat's expression, and a single unspoken thought entered Osman's mind. Unworthy. The saldrig turned in its path and walked back up the canyon without even a single glance back. Had it spit on the ground before leaving, it wouldn't have added any more contempt to its utter dismissal of Osman and his worth. Osman slid down the canyon's wall and dared to look over his shoulder to examine the wall at his back. It was, in fact, not the end of the canyon, but a giant boulder wedged between the walls of the ravine, a small gap opening into deeper darkness underneath it. Not wanting to wander again through the moonlight with the saldrig lurking nearby, Osman scrambled under the suspended rock. Winding under the boulder and then around and through the rockfall beyond, he found a small nook not much larger than himself that not even a breath of wind touched and still held the warmth of the day. Pulling his hood up and wrapping his cloak around him, Osman released a shaky sigh of relief as his racing heart began to settle. He had left the camp in a sulky huff, leaning into the sensation of his torso being bloated, like after taking too large a breath and holding it. It was one of the few keel left to Osman that he could still feel, so he dove into it and made a great show of his bad mood by going off into the darkness to brood and think. It easily could have cost him his life. Still immersed in the mindset of his adolescent angst and stark lesson, Osman had no intention of braving the night again to attempt a return to the fire. He only hoped the shelter of the nook he huddled in could ward off the deep chill of night. Osman closed his eyes and tried to find sleep. Osman awoke to sunlight penetrating through his eyelids. His body ached from sleeping upright in a sitting position, knees to chest and head leaning on a large stone wedged between the rocks cradling him. Osman flexed his aching limbs, stiff from cold and confinement, and crawled on all fours toward the sunlight, pins and needles plaguing his every extremity. After several minutes, Osman realized the path he followed was unfamiliar and did not seem to be the one he had used to get to this place. With no room to turn around, Osman continued crawling forward, hoping the light leading his way would circle back to the camp, or at least the pass through the mountains so he could find it again. The path ahead opened up, and Osmond scurried forward, anxious to escape the claustrophobic space he traversed and put the night behind him. Osmond stood up and immediately stretched his arms to the sky, lifting his heels off the ground to make himself as big as possible after feeling so cramped and confined. He had assumed he was back in the pass in one of the cliff's switchback alcoves, but that was not the case. Before he could even assess his surroundings, he saw the man staring at him from across the chamber. Osmond, startled and instantly wary, dropped into a defensive stance. Out of habit, the iron dagger leaped to his hand, and through instinct and Talon's training, Osmond scanned for cover or anything he could use to his advantage, but there were scant options anywhere near. The man did not move a muscle, and as Osmond's mind slowed out of survival mode, assessing his rival, he processed who the man was. Osmond stood frozen in place as a shaft of sunlight breaking free from the clouds illuminated the face of the man across from him. His face. "It's me!" Osmond spoke the words out loud to solidify what he saw as reality and not some dream or vision. Looking around, Osmond realized he was not in another canyon or the mountain pass, but a cave with a large opening high in the eastern wall through which the morning sun poured in. Across from him was not a man. It was a painting, practically a mirror image of himself in the dueling armor he used to wear on Hearth's Rest in Arnador. The image of himself was happy, swords drawn in a relaxed, cocky stance and a smile that looked as if it barely contained an outburst of laughter. As Osmond approached, he could see every stroke and detail was perfection in its line and care. This was a masterpiece, a work of love. Osmond reached out and touched the hard stone the miracle before him had been painted on. He examined it through his eyes and fingers. Every stitch of cloth, rivet of armor, and nick in his swords, recreated in paint. There was no question as to who had painted such a tribute, and when Osmond looked into the joy mirrored on his own face, the force of the emotion behind the masterpiece dropped him to his knees. There, on the creases he never saw or knew in life, were the fingerprints of his father reading the face of his son, too impatient to wait for the paint to fully dry.